Hi, everyone. I'm Ken Stern. I'm delighted to welcome you to another Bard Center for the Study of Hate webinar. And I'm particularly delighted to have Sam Freedman with us today. And Sam, I appreciate we were going to have you come to Bard to speak to students, to speak to the faculty, and because of the changes with COVID, we're doing this. But we're actually having a much broader audience, which I think is one of the few benefits of the change that we had to do in this format. For those of you who don't know Sam, he's an accomplished author. He's a prize-winning author of many books. He teaches at Columbia in the journalism school, and he's also a former columnist and still writes for various outlets. We used to be the New York Times for writing about education, writing about religion, and so forth. And Sam, you know, for if anybody knows somebody who wants to go to journalism school and learn how to write a book, Sam is the guy who teaches that class. And I don't know, Sam, if you remember years ago, before I started my book on the American Indian movement, a mutual friend introduced us and said, you have to talk to Sam about how to put a book together. So a lot of my book writing is, even though I never took your classes, yeah, and we also ended up going for coffee at a place where my wife and I 32 years ago went on our first date about a week later. So anyway, so I thank you for that venue as well. But in any event, Sam is, as I said, an old friend. And as I put in the introduction, he's working on a book that I thought timed beautifully, even though it's not going to come out for a few years, his research on issues that are incredibly current. Sam wanted to look at post-war America, and he was looking at 48 and the Democratic Convention, and Hubert Humphrey's actually spending a lot of time in looking through the archives as much as he can during the time of COVID. And he was finding various different parallels and lessons about how we should think about hatred today from what he was learning from that period of time in his research. So I thought, gee, we're going to have the Republican convention, we're going to have the Democratic convention. We're kicking off the final stretch of the elections. Hate is a continuing concern in politics, and I figured there's no better person than Sam. So Sam is going to speak for about 20, 25 minutes. And then what we're going to do is you will see at the bottom a Q&A button. So put your questions in there and I will moderate them and ask them to Sam, and we'll finish in an hour. So I welcome everybody, and thank you, Sam, so much for your graciousness and spending some time with us today.
Thank you. It's great to be with you, Ken, and glad to be with the greater Bard community. And I look forward to when the fever breaks and I can be with you all in physical space. So in talking about 2020, I think back actually to 1968. In 1968, I was 12 years old, getting ready to turn 13 that fall. And I had the first job of my life, which was to be a paper boy for the New Brunswick, New Jersey Home News. And in a way, I could never have fathomed at the point I picked up the paper route just because I wanted to make a little spending money so I could go down to the Rivoli Music Shop in New Brunswick and buy 45s, buy singles, for those of you who remember that particular technology. It ended up giving me this sometimes painfully close-in view of the events of that year. Generally, it was a matter of pride for me to do the paper route by myself. I didn't want any paternal or maternal involvement, but occasionally, if it was a really horrible day out, my mother would drive alongside me in the family station wagon so the newspapers could stay dry. And every couple of houses, I'd grab, a half dozen from her, toss them on the porches, then go back and get more. And it was on a rainy, late afternoon, first week of April 1968, as we were doing my paper route, that we heard the bulletin on the radio about Martin Luther King being shot. A little more than 2 months later, it was a Wednesday morning, and my mother came in to wake me up. to get ready for school, which is really unusual because normally my clock radio would wake me up. And she shook me by the shoulder and said, "Sam, something terrible happened last night." And all I could think of is that my father had died. And she said, "They shot Bobby Kennedy." And after school that day, I went on my paper route, and there was one particular family. I remember they were an immigrant family from Honduras, but they spoke pretty good English, and obviously they read English because they subscribed to the home news. And when I went to their house to deliver the paper, the mother came up to me just with a stricken look on her face and asked how they could publish a paper on a day like this. And then at the end of that week, Bobby Kennedy's funeral train ran up the old Penn Central tracks from Washington up ultimately to Massachusetts. And it ran right through my hometown of Highland Park, New Jersey. There were people I knew standing on the sidings, crying and holding flowers and so on. And then it was later that summer, an early evening, after I'd finished my paper route on that particular afternoon, when I sat watching the news coverage of the Chicago Democratic Convention and the police riot against the anti-war protesters and the attacks on journalists and the complete turmoil and upheaval that surrounded the Democratic Convention. And of course, this was a year of a great many protests, of a great deal of violence born out of, the frustration and anger of the assassinations. And it set forth, and this is where I'm leading to, a presidential campaign that bears some important similarities, but also some revealing differences from the one that we're in right now. In 1968, Richard Nixon, whose convention made a show of being extremely well organized, well structured, smooth, placid, a real package for a TV event, and thus a total counterpoint to the chaos and rancor of the Democratic Convention. Richard Nixon was running on a law and order platform. I mean, there were other elements to his platform too. He had his supposedly secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. He had his secret back channel private negotiations with the South Vietnamese not to do a peace deal brokered by Lyndon Johnson, but to wait for him because they'd get a better deal, though we didn't know about that till later. So law and order was a huge domestic issue. And the most obvious Donald Trump analog of that time was George Wallace. George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, who had run initially in Democratic primaries and had done shockingly well, including in some of the northern states. Ultimately ran a third-party candidacy. And what Nixon did in that race by seizing the issue of law and order and making that really a code word for race was to try to seize that incredibly powerful and polarizing issue. And by not being as explicitly racist as George Wallace then was, although I should say for the sake of historical accuracy, Wallace later in his life made an incredibly sincere set of acts of contrition and penance that are tremendously moving, and you should go and read about them. But at this time, Wallace was an unrepentant segregationist and almost a literal bomb thrower in the political landscape. So Nixon had to somewhat euphemize Wallace's language, but to get the same point across. It was sometimes called the Southern strategy because he was aiming at taking Southern states that had begun to drift away from the Democrats because of Lyndon Johnson's civil rights legislation and trying to lock them in now firmly with the Republicans. But it turned out, as we've seen in the decades since then, to be an effective strategy in many white ethnic working class parts of the North as well. And what Nixon was trying to do was lay all the social disorder of that time at the feet of Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, who became the Democratic nominee when first Johnson withdrew from the race, and then Bobby Kennedy, who was headed to the nomination, was of course assassinated. So Nixon was offering himself as the person who would fix what was broken in the society. And what we know from certain studies that have been done of the voting public at that time is that the more violence there was surrounding the protests, the more that was a divisive issue for a certain set of swing voters, and I'm not even thinking here just of Southern Democrats who were dyed-in-the-wool segregationists all along, and were now going to the party Republicans that tended to adopt them. But I'm talking about in the North, union members, blue-collar voters, people in states like Michigan and Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, that are the ones very much in play now, who were receptive to that argument. So I think you can see why there's some very obvious parallels to the election we're heading into. The biggest difference, and we'll have to see how this plays out, is twofold. Number one, what's different is that Hubert Humphrey was part of the existing administration. He wasn't president, but he was vice president. Nixon was an outsider, a challenger, someone who wasn't holding office, and was in a better position to point the finger of blame for the social disorder on the current administration. It's 180 degrees different now. Donald Trump is the president. The upsurge in hate crime, in violence, in social discord has all happened on his watch, and in fact, in many ways has been provoked by him in a way far more explicit than anything Nixon ever would have contemplated. The other difference, and again, we'll have to see how this plays out, is what the voting public, and I mean specifically, let's say the white portion of the voting public, thinks now about issues of social justice. Remember, in 1968, a lot of the civil rights legislation that had been passed, and even huge nonviolent events like the March on Washington in 1963, were unpopular with the majority of white Americans. You can go and find a New York Times editorial before the March on Washington saying it's going to be too confrontational. This kind of public civil disobedience is going to be the enemy of gradual progress. And so in that respect, it's hardly surprising that a large enough share of the white electorate was ready to register its, call it anxiety, call it racism, call it whatever you want, by voting for Nixon. And particularly because the sense was, all these landmark civil rights laws have been passed. What are you still protesting about, you Black people? What are you being so violent about? Didn't we pass these laws already? We're in a very different situation now. We're coming out of a period when there has not been progress, when there's been steady regression, some of it done through the Supreme Court in striking down the Voting Rights Act, for instance, some of it done in terms of public rhetoric, some of it done economically in terms of what first the Great Recession and now the recession we're having during the pandemic have done to wipe out the gains to Black middle class income and Black home ownership that had been gradually accumulating through the 70s and 80s and 90s and aughts. So the climate now is not one when there's likely to be quite as much white head scratching about why is there discontent among people of color in this country. The other difference is that even as we watch Donald Trump try to play to the suburban vote, I've said for many years, as someone who cut his teeth as a reporter covering suburbia, one of the great untold stories in this country is the increasing diversity in all ways of suburbia, particularly inner ring suburbs, that the stereotype that Trump is playing on of white picket fence, white people, suburbia, the kind of stereotype that movies like American Beauty kind of brainlessly perpetuate, is very much at odds with the changing racial composition of the suburbs, the changing income level of the suburbs, and also the lived experience of people, and I'm talking about here, I should say specifically white people, in suburbs as well as in cities, who have come of age in a period when racial diversity has been a higher value in this country than it was leading up to 1968, when things like interracial marriage had become very common and normative in most parts of this country. In 1968, it had only been 1 year since 17 state laws against interracial marriage had to be struck down by the Supreme Court, in which the books that our children read and are assigned in schools reflect a much greater demographic range of who lives in America. And so if you just consider that a middle-aged voter now, someone who is 45 to 50 years old for the 2020 election, wasn't even alive in 1968. So this, I think, can be potentially a very different demographic. And Donald Trump has basically put all of his markers down on the playing board on hoping that he can excite a 1968 type of reaction. But the alternative way things can go is what we saw in the 2018 midterms, in which it was a big boost in turnout in the suburbs and a big swing in party affiliation in the suburbs, particularly on the part of white women who had been Republicans or Republican-leaning independents before and who went with their votes to the Democrats. The two elections we just went through, and I'm checking my watch there just for a moment to make sure I don't cut into too much of our discussion time. The two conventions we've just seen vividly, starkly put on display what this campaign is going to be about. It's really going to be two dueling views of dystopia. You know, if you think about 2016, the Republican convention was definitely about a view of America as dystopia, American carnage. The Democratic convention coming out of the Obama years was about, again, this cultural mosaic, this ideal that Martin Luther King called the beloved community, this emergent coalition of young people, educated people, people of color, queer people, that was going to continue to build on what had been accomplished during 2 terms of Barack Obama. That's not what the Democrats are running on this year. So what we saw in the Democratic convention, even though there were many, uplifting moments within it, but overall, what we saw and what, Michelle Obama, Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, and ultimately Joe Biden hammered home in their speeches is the sense that the current America is dystopic. Dystopic because a pandemic has been allowed to rage without any kind of science-based, thought-through answer. Dystopic because as a result of not finding a way to control the pandemic, our economy is in tatters. Dystopic because the president has stirred up racial division and, having ignited the flame, squirted lighter fluid all over it. So that was the story the Democrats are telling. And it's a story that says that the way to restore calmness, sanity, a basis in reality is to elect Joe Biden. And yes, there are a lot of other policy positions behind that, many of which are quite progressive in terms of healthcare and climate change and bankruptcy reform and free college tuition in public colleges, et cetera, et cetera. But the emotional trigger for the campaign, and that's a term I learned from a political consultant I knew, he said every successful race has to have an emotional trigger. The emotional trigger is end the dystopia, bring us back to normal, not to utopia, but to normality. And then the Democratic Convention, of course, was followed a week later by the Republican Convention, which laid out a completely irreconcilable narrative, except in the sense that it also portrayed dystopia. And while, yes, there were some fleeting attempts to show that Donald Trump's racial enlightenment and concern about immigrants has somehow been overlooked, and to try to soften his rough edges or present them as he's just a guy who says what he what he really means. And in spite of efforts to pretend that the pandemic had been quelled and dealt with already, the dominant tone of that convention was the Republican dystopia narrative. And in the Republican dystopia narrative, dystopia is the occasionally violent side of otherwise nonviolent protests during the Black Lives Matter protests of the spring and summer. It's a dystopia based on wildly exaggerated notions of Antifa, as if this is some unified movement, sort of like, Comintern, as if this is like the Communist International or something, and a wildly exaggerated version of what Joe Biden would do, that he will be the willing or unwitting pawn of diehard socialists who will end democracy as we know it and take away American freedom. So these are these two clashing narratives. And, in the wake of Jacob Blake's shooting in Kenosha by a white police officer, and then the shooting by a white militia member of 3 protesters, 2 fatally and 1 not, we've seen both candidates really lay out what we're going to see, I think, all for the rest of the fall. Donald Trump has spoken approvingly of Kyle Rittenhouse, of the alleged murderer in that case. And he's dismissed the policeman who shot unarmed Jacob Blake 7 times as the equivalent of a golfer who chokes on an easy putt. Joe Biden, at his speech in Pittsburgh earlier this week, was seeking to hold 2 thoughts in dynamic tension, which was to very clearly criticize arson, looting, physical violence as not forms of protest, but at much greater length to both talk about the injustices, the systemic racism that led to Jacob Blake's shooting, as well as George Floyd's killing, Breonna Taylor's killing, many, many others we've had just in the last few months, and to point out that the person who benefits from stimulating violence, from catalyzing violent confrontation, is Donald Trump. So, I've used this metaphor before, but it's not mine originally. I've seen other people using it. So Donald Trump is the arsonist who wants to then be the firefighter. So those are the 2 narratives that I feel quite sure are going to dominate through the fall. Obviously, there's no way of knowing what else could happen. We don't know what the equivalent in this cycle will be of the Access Hollywood tape or James Comey's statements about Hillary Clinton's emails that hit unexpectedly during the 2016 campaign, and each of which rocked the race for a certain amount of time. But some of that is bound to happen. It's just in the nature of politics. But I'd be very surprised if any kind of a different set of dueling narratives emerges. So that's my, that's my take on where we are at this point and on some of the historical parallels or not to it. And really at this point, I'd like to use the time we have left to field any questions you all have.
Great, thank you so much, Sam, for that overview. I really appreciate it. So if people have questions, just as a reminder, just type them into the Q&A button and I will forward them to Sam. While we're waiting for people to do that, I have 1 or 2 questions for you, Sam,
Sure.
too. So, I really appreciate your focus on the idea of emotional triggers and getting people into the, ginned up to feel compelled to support one side or the other about the idea of, ending dystopia. I think that's spot on. A lot of when we look about issues of hatred, we tend to think of it as, I guess the working definition of hate studies uses, defining another, an us versus them, and then demonizing or dehumanizing, seeing that other that you're defining as a threat to yourself. And a lot of how hate gets played out is noble. It's self-defense. It's, I'm fighting for myself and my family and my way of life and so forth. And, you and I may, as both being, on the progressive side of things, see some of the threats that, to democracy and so forth from Trump in terms of the press is the enemy of the people, and talking about judges and stoking, even before the current situation with Black Lives Matter and the protests, talking about Mexicans as rapists and Muslims have to register and so forth. So we get that. There are people on the other side, as you point out, that equally see by the vision of there's, Antifa, George Soros, left-wing Democrats are going to destroy your way of life too. And it's not that they don't believe it, they do. So the question I have for you is, looking at the moment where we're going through these plays and polls and us versus them, how much of an impact do you think what we've seen over the last decade or so with social media and media more generally has had with this, in the sense that people either were on Facebook or they choose to go to Fox News or MSNBC, get into their own bubbles and their own buckets and get reinforced for what they want to believe? And as you were talking, I was thinking about how that might have played out in, social media, and the media was that fragmented in '68 when we had Wallace and Nixon and Humphrey in the Democratic Convention, or even, the book you're working on in '48. How much do you think that this new phenomenon has an impact on what we're seeing?
I think social media has a phenomenon, but there are always new technologies. Every new technology that comes into play seems like it has a power that nothing prior to it had. Whether it was pamphleteering, or if you think about the coming of radio, if you think about a period in the 1930s when, you had figures like Father Coughlin being extremely powerful, putting out a right-wing populist message that in many ways anticipates Donald Trump. Coughlin was doing that by having a regular radio show, as well as having his mailing list for his written materials. So he didn't have social media, but he was able to reach a large and very active public as a result of that. I think that, particularly as a journalism professor, I'm very alert to these things. The fact that in 1968, you had large media companies that dominated coverage in this country did make it harder to, on a widespread basis, put out a narrative that had no basis in fact. And this is a point where I want to say that in framing the question as you did in talking about the belief among Trump voters about the perfidy of George Soros and Antifa, it's true that there's an equivalent view from there of the left as the threat to impose dystopia, but it's not equally fact-based. The fear of what Trump demonstrably has said and done is based in reality. The fears are being whipped up about Antifa and George Soros are wildly exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated. And in Soros's case, it's sort of classic anti-Semitic canard about the rich Jew pulling the puppet strings. In fact, between Antifa and George Soros, you have kind of the classic duality of anti-Semitism, which is that Jews are both the revolutionaries and the capitalists. In any case, so it was harder in 1968 when you had three main broadcast networks, and if you're going to watch TV news, you to watch ABC, NBC, or CBS. You had major news magazines like Time and Life that circulated in the tens of millions of people. You did not have talk radio. You did not have cable TV. Obviously, you didn't have the internet. So the downside of that is that mainstream discourse omitted a lot of voices. The mainstream media at that time didn't have a lot of Black voices, didn't have a lot of women's voices, didn't have a lot of immigrant voices, didn't have a lot of queer voices. That's the downside. It was a very white male enterprise, and we need to not venerate it falsely. But what was positive about it is that there was, compared to now, a much greater agreed upon set of facts. That even if you could say that, you know, Newsweek was a little more liberal than Time, and U.S. News and World Report was a little bit more conservative than Time on the other side, or that maybe ABC's Evening News was a little bit less liberal in tone than Cronkite on CBS, there was a basic agreement on facts. And the ideological journalism of that time, whether it was National Review or New Republic or The Nation, was about interpretations of facts. It wasn't about inventing new facts. It was about, given the fact pattern, how do we interpret it in a way that supports our view of what proper policy is. And a really good illustration of the difference between then and now is what William F. Buckley famously said when he was urging the conservative movement to exile the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society, for those who don't know, trafficked in conspiracy theories that would be very familiar in our political world today. The John Birch Society believed the United Nations was a stealthy way to create world government. The John Birch Society believed that putting fluoride in water supplies to fight tooth decay was, you know, an evil plot of some kind. Think about people, you know, talking about masks taking away their freedom and how they won't take the COVID vaccine if it's ever created. That's the John Birch Society and fluoride and its anti-fluoride campaign. The John Birch Society said Dwight Eisenhower was a communist dupe. And, you know, the Birch Society began to make inroads into the legitimate Republican Party of its time, particularly the Barry Goldwater campaign at points. But William F. Buckley, when he was editor of National Review, wrote a very principled and important excommunication of the Birchers from the conservative movement and the Republican Party. And he referred to their part of the political landscape as Crackpot Alley. Now, Crackpot Alley, in large measure, is the Republican Party, or is the Trump Party. And I think Republicans who don't want to be in Crackpot Alley have either begun to redefine themselves as independents or as Democrats or as never Trumpers. And so I'd even say that when we look at this data that shows, you know, whatever it is, 85% of Republicans support Donald Trump, you have to correlate that to see what's going on with what share of the voting public now identifies as Republican compared to the percentage who would have identified as Republican, say, when Mitt Romney was running, or John McCain, or George W. Bush. So you have a shrinking corpus of Republicans, but those who identify are more fiercely attached to the Trumpian version of the party. And yes, social media has a huge effect in reaffirming that, and also because social media has been so prone to being manipulated by Russian agents and other actors of hostile states to stir up discord, to try to diminish voter turnout, especially among minorities, to plant disinformation campaigns. So in both those respects, social media has been problematic. So even though Facebook and Twitter isn't the first time we've dealt with the challenges of a new technology, we dealt with it with TV, we dealt with it with radio. I think that the vast scope and the instantaneity of social media adds to the problem. And the last thing I'll say, and then take the next question, is the other difference is that there's no FCC, there's no Federal Communications Commission, and there's no fairness doctrine that tries to bring any order or regulation to social media. You're entirely depending on private companies to police themselves. That has not been the case historically for television and radio, although some of the oversight has been eroded since the Reagan years, which also is a problem, but there are at least still remnants of it. Social media has never had any of it. And I think that until there is some level of oversight, social media will never adequately be able to police itself.
All right, thank you, Sam. The next question is, Nixon's law and order bit resonated in '68, but does that trope work past Trump's base? The suburbs are no longer white and the city black. I live in Portland, and it's scenes of white protesters in a gentrified city that have captured the narrative.
I completely agree with what you said. You know, the suburbs are a lot more diverse in many metro areas, infinitely more than they were in 1968. And clearly Trump is banking on the fact that he can still leverage fear of black crime, you know, air quotes around that. You know, that's really what he's trotting back out, is fear of black crime. Black people are going to move into your suburb, they're going to rob you, they're going to attack your women. These things that go back to the Confederacy, for God's sakes. He's counting on the fact that that playbook can still work. My inclination is to think it won't, because suburbia has changed so much and because it's very visible that he's provoking and cheering on a lot of the discord rather than trying in a leaderly way to quell it. But because of the Electoral College's makeup, you know, Trump lost by 3 million votes in 2016 and still won in the Electoral College. Because of the way that map is, in which rural votes, we're not, you know, I'm not talking about suburban votes as we traditionally think of them, but exurban votes, rural votes, count for way more than city or first-ring suburb votes because of how electoral votes are apportioned. So that I think what it really is about is playing on the fear of Blacks, Muslims, immigrants, Hispanics, a certain kind of Jew, in parts of the country that have virtually no experience and no exposure to them, that it will drive up Trump's turnout so much in the exurbs and the rural areas that he can take just enough of the states that he needs to take to win. You know, if you think about, you know, quintessential suburban county like Macomb County, or maybe it's pronounced Macomb, outside of Detroit, that was the county where Stanley Greenberg, the pollster, coined the term Reagan Democrats for union members, kind of traditional Democrats who voted for Reagan starting in 1980. So the flip there happened 40 years ago, you know, among those white working class voters. I think what the story is now, and so in 2016, is a turnout vote, not so much a demographic vote or a geographical vote.
Great, thanks, Sam. So I'm going to combine two questions into one because they're not identical, but they're related. So one is there not also a parallel between '68 and 2020 in the action or inaction of the, quote, progressive voters who find Biden too moderate? They say it won't happen this time, but I'm old enough to remember similar attitudes about Humphrey in relation to the war. This was especially true in the key state of California, which gave left voters several third-party alternatives. What do you think? And the other is a more expansive question, but on the same sort of theme of '68 and 2020, is what can '68 teach us to help defeat Trump?
Right. Well, I think there's some big differences in terms of where progressives will be. Remember, because of the violence around the '68 convention, a convention at which Humphrey, much as I admire him, and I'm writing about his early career in my book in progress, but Humphrey didn't really run in any primaries other than in a symbolic way. He was installed as the nominee by broadly unpopular party establishment people like Lyndon Johnson and Mayor Daley. Then he bore the responsibility in the public's eyes for all the violence around the convention, and particularly for progressives and people in the anti-war movement, for attacks on anti-war protesters by the police. So that was laid right at Humphrey's feet. And Humphrey also had only very belatedly come out against the Vietnam War. So he had a lot that was estranging him from progressives all along. And there's nothing comparable to that for Joe Biden this year. Secondly, Eugene McCarthy, who was the peace candidate, as the phrase went, in 1968, who ran the initial challenge to Lyndon Johnson. And after beating him or running a very strong second, I can't remember which it was, in the New Hampshire primary, basically that's what encouraged Johnson to drop out of the race. Although Gene McCarthy remained a hero of progressives. In fact, for a certain kind of progressive, he was more of a hero than Bobby Kennedy was, because he got into the race first, because he'd never been a hatchet man for Joe McCarthy the way Bobby Kennedy had been, and so on. And Gene McCarthy waited till the very last days of the '68 campaign to give a very, very tepid endorsement to Hubert Humphrey. And I think that hurt a lot. You compare that to this year when Bernie Sanders, who again gave a very tepid endorsement for a lot of reasons, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't, to Hillary Clinton in 2016, Bernie Sanders has been unequivocal and passionate on behalf of Biden in this case, and it's been consistent. It hasn't been a sense of Bernie Sanders as frog marched up, to the camera to give a convention speech, with his arm twisted behind his back. What really came through is someone who knows exactly what's at stake here if Trump wins. And I think someone who also knows that, a lot of Sanders' agenda has sort of carried the day and is going to be a big part of the platform. So that's another thing that'll be different this year is I think you'll have Sanders and other progressive speakers of consequence out there pretty sincerely campaigning. Another thing that's different is there was no test run in 1968 for what would happen if people sat on their hands and didn't vote for Humphrey, even though they hated Nixon. You didn't get, an earlier version to see how that movie turned out. Same thing as in 2020, when people thought, oh, Al Gore's probably going to win anyway, but I'm sick of him in the Clinton period, or, I'm going to vote, or it's not a progressive enough platform, but he'll win anyway, so I'm going to cast my vote for Ralph Nader. They didn't have a trial run to see what happens if you do that, how you lose Florida because of that. And I think everyone, except the number of first-time voters who turned 18 since 2016, every other voter out there did a trial run of this experiment of what happens if I don't vote for a moderate, because the moderate is too moderate. What do I get instead? Well, you saw what you got. And I think there is no illusion about that. And I think that's why you see this kind of totally unprecedented set of endorsements for Biden. You have Jeff Flake and William Kristol, from the right, or what's traditionally been sort of the rational right in this country. And you have Angela Davis and Noam Chomsky, lifelong Marxists on the left. I don't think that's because any of them are so passionate about Biden per se. I think it's because there's a realization of what's at stake and a learned lesson from 2016 of what happens if you, stand on your purity principles and either don't vote or vote for a third party.
Great, thanks, Sam. So I'm going to take a long question and sort of condense it, but it's looking at 68 in Chicago. It says in 68, people on TV believe their lying eyes. Today, if you drive through downtown Chicago and elsewhere, you can see dystopia. People can see the violence and who is causing it. It's overwhelmingly left-wing. They can see mayors and governors turn down federal help, and the violence continues. People resent the media trying to tell them otherwise. So I guess, I would reframe that some. Clearly, lots of peaceful protests, and Trump is not talking about those. He's showing the images and talking about the looting and so forth, but the looting is real. People, small businesses are having, problems on top of COVID, and that's resonating. So how do you see that playing out?
I think that'll be a huge part of what Joe Biden has to address. And I think you have to show, empathy for people who've lost their property. In Minneapolis, where I am now, a lot of the destruction was in an area of town in which a lot of the small businesses are owned by immigrants, owned by people of color. And the other thing that has been true in certain places is that you've actually had people in the Black community speaking out against the violence, including the families of George Floyd, the family of Jacob Blake, saying, don't do this and justify this, in my child's name. So I think part of what the Democrats have to do is amplify those voices. And I think that part of it for Biden as a candidate is going to be showing genuine empathy for people who have lost what they had. But I think you also have to come back to the fact that this wasn't a sudden out of nowhere outbreak of violence after George Floyd. George Floyd's murder happened within about a week of the video of Ahmaud Arbery's shooting by vigilantes becoming public. It happened during a period when a lot of the disclosures about Breonna Taylor's killing in her own bed were becoming public. So several volatile moments clustered together. And you also have to think, if you go back to Trayvon Martin being killed in 2013, there have been a series of extrajudicial or police killings of unarmed Black people since then. And most of them did not result in violence or in any large-scale violence. There was a long period of being patient and waiting for justice to be done in other ways, and it didn't happen. And it's also true that the rhetoric from the top has been about provoking violence. So I think a Democratic candidate has to be able to do two things. You have to, say no tolerance for this spin-off violence that's, ruined the reputation of otherwise very peaceful protests. But you also have to say no tolerance for, for these modern day lynchings either. And this anger didn't come from nowhere. And part of what the role of leadership is rather than exciting more hostility, is to try to, calm and reason people to de-escalate that hostility. And so that's going to be a big part of the challenge. And two more points I want to add. Number one, remember, we've seen instances of agents provocateur. I don't think they're responsible for the majority of the violence, but right here in Minneapolis, there was footage that was taken on one of the nights of the most destruction of someone dressed in all Black with a claw hammer, methodically busting the window of an auto parts store, busting every window one after another, trying, resisting being restrained by a Black Lives Matter protester, and then going off. And he was subsequently identified as a member of a white supremacist militia. So we know that there will be some instances of provocateurs doing this. When Trump talks about the shooting of a law officer in Oakland, it was done by a Boogaloo boy. It wasn't done by a Black Lives Matter protester. So we have to remind people of that too. And if I were mayor of a big city, I don't think that getting support from the Trump administration now is going to calm anything down. We've seen what happened when they brought in basically an unidentified paramilitary force into Portland and literally grabbed people off the street as if this is Argentina in the 70s and it's the dirty war and people are going to be disappeared. So I don't think any sensible mayor wants to bring that in. Sitting here in Minneapolis, I could fault our mayor in plenty of ways, and I have in private conversations with friends, for the lame response to a lot of what's happened here. But do I think that bringing in paramilitaries from Trump would have made things better? Hell no.
Thank you, Sam. So I have a Gerald L.K. Smith question for you. So
Okay.
I figured that would excite you. So Gerald L.K. Smith was national coordinator for Huey P. Long until the assassination in 1935. So must have shared the pro-organized labor and share our wealth positions. How did Christian National Crusade twist his position until 56? And what does that provide insight into the evangelical Protestant Trump support? Molly Worthen's book and lectures on advocates of reasons would indicate skepticism about Trump as a Christian voice.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked about Gerald L.K. Smith. I'm writing about him a lot in my book because he is one of Hubert Humphrey's big antagonists during the 1940s. Smith comes repeatedly to Minneapolis to give speeches. His pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic and anti-Black politics make him, really powerful foil and antagonist and adversary for Humphrey. And you're right, this is the problem with populism. Populism is multivalent. You're absolutely right. Gerald L.K. Smith started out, as did Huey Long, as a, in terms of economic principles, social justice-oriented person. So did Father Coughlin, for that matter, too. The difference is that with the exception of Huey Long, who, whatever his other faults, never played the race card, which is kind of amazing for being a Southerner of his time and place. It's not like he was some great racial healer, but he never played the race card in order to win, or in order even to be a demagogue. He had other forms of demagoguery, but racism was not one of them. But otherwise, the original sin of populism is that it doesn't want to extend its populist benefits to the other. That populism is a form of affirmative action for whites. Populism is a form of action for the Volk, for whoever can be construed as being the real, true citizens of the state of Louisiana, or the United States of America, or France, or whatever. And so right-wing populism always has to define itself in contradistinction to an undeserving other who should not share in the redistributive economics. That's, this was Hitler's game too, that you rebuild a shattered economy and you create a social welfare state with big public work spending and a lot of things Trump, were he more competent, would have followed through on his offers to do. You do big public works projects, you put people back to work, but only your people. It's the reason, even though he's now betraying his promise, Trump has always said he would protect Social Security and, and Medicare and so on, because he knows that right-wing populism is offering a social safety net, but only for certain people. I think that, I'm someone who for 10 years wrote a column about religion for the New York Times, and I've written 2 books about American religion. And I think what has happened in the evangelical movement is a tragedy for the country and for evangelical Christianity, because right at a point where I think evangelicals, towards the end of the millennium, were starting to explore some really interesting new positions on issues like immigration, climate change, prison reform. They've dropped all that and more fully than ever adopted a sense of themselves as basically being a political movement. I think we have to think of evangelical Christianity now as a political movement rather than as a form of religious expression. And as Robert Jones, the Public Religion Research Institute, has often written, there are a lot of people who, when they describe themselves as being evangelical, aren't particularly churchgoers, they're not particularly Bible studiers. They use that descriptor as a way of saying, basically, I'm a blue-collar white person. It's a way of expressing a certain kind of racial identity and sense of racial resentment. And just saying I'm evangelical is the term that they hang on themselves. And I think the most penetrating critiques of what Trumpism and its embrace by evangelical leaders has meant to Christianity are done by evangelicals themselves. I'd recommend you read a piece that Michael Gerson, who was a speechwriter for George W. Bush for many years, wrote for the Atlantic Monthly about 1.5 years ago about what the embrace of Trump has done to severely damage the Christian witness of evangelical Christians. And Pete Wenners, who writes for The Atlantic and for the New York Times, has written a number of essays in both of those places making the similar argument. So, don't take my Jewish word for it. Look at what people like Pete Wenners and Michael Gerson, who grew up as evangelicals, who are proud of that identity, and who felt that now they no longer want to claim it because of what it's become. Read what they say about it.
Great. Thank you, Sam. I want to follow up on that, on the economic aspect, just for one quick question. I had a glass of wine a couple of years ago with your Columbia colleague, Ira Katz-Nelson, who had to me, a very, prescient and perceptive analysis of what was going on in the world and support for Trump and so forth. And I'll tell you what it is in a minute, but I also thought that it was reflective of remembering 68 and 48 as well. And his observation was, back in the earlier years, disaffected white folk, by and large, looked to their labor movement. Right. And you and I both remember, the outsized importance of the labor movement, George Meany and so forth in 68, I'm sure with Humphrey and, the Farm Labor Party and so forth in 48. Right. So, how much of what we're seeing now with people that feel disaffected, disrespected, overlooked, replaced, not having the labor movement to go to, but falling into this other type of messaging, how much of a role do you think that plays, and what can we do about it?
I think it's huge. I think Ira Katz-Nelson is absolutely right. Labor unions, first of all, did a lot of worker education. They did a lot of worker organizing, and their goal was to push for better quality of life. And the best of them, like the United Auto Workers under Walter Reuther, also really in the forefront of civil rights, of taking what had frankly been some of the racism of particularly the craft unions in the first half of the 20th century, and really changing that and making unions like the UAW and the steel workers and others real emblems of multiracial labor unions. So the attack on organized labor, which has been an ongoing project of conservatives back to the Taft-Hartley law passed in the late 1940s, that has been a way to try to undermine Democratic Party and the liberal cause in this country because of the importance of organized labor. And the idea of casting labor as just another special interest, even to its own rank and file, has been tragically successful. And so, you had in the early 70s about 30 or 33% of the private sector workforce in this country in labor unions. Now it's barely at 10%. And you've had right-wing populists who get their money from people like the Koch brothers, from oligarchs like Scott Walker in Wisconsin, the former governor, make their political agenda breaking unions. And what they've tried to do is divide and conquer, is they go after public sector unions and try to present them as being different from other unions, and to really then get basically people in fields where unions have been broken, or in right-to-work states where unions have many more obstacles even setting up, and get them to hate on unionized workers. So in Dan Kaufman's excellent book, The Fall of Wisconsin, which is about how Wisconsin went from this beacon of progressivism to, the state that reelected Scott Walker a couple of times and went for Reagan. One of the things that Dan writes about in his book, which is really revealing, is that blue-collar Wisconsinites, their attitude, they look at teachers, for instance, and say, why should they get to have a pension? Why should they get to have the summer off? Why should they get to have, health care, through their employer or whatever it is? So the mentality is so self-defeating on former, or even some current private sector union workers, whose view is, why don't we organize and push our employer to give us benefits like those teachers got by organizing? It's let's take something away from them. Let's make the teachers as miserable as we are, and living as hand to mouth as we are, and that'll be better. So it's perverse, but that's kind of their emotional trigger. And I think one of the most beneficial things that a Biden administration could do would be to do some modern version of the Wagner Act, which was the piece of New Deal legislation that basically created much more positive conditions for unions to organize. And that led to the boom in union membership, which was a big part of what led to the boom in the creation of the middle class.
Great, thank you, Sam. We have a bunch of other questions, but we're up at the end of our hour, so I don't want to keep you any longer. But I appreciate the overview and the analysis and people's participation. And again, on behalf of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, I want to thank you and wish you good luck with your research.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to your book.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. And I hope all of you out there in Zoom land enjoyed it. Be well.
Have a good day, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.